Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. So wrote William Shakespeare. And it seems, if this is true, the first two groups, those who are born great and those who go after it and attain it, we hear a lot about. And they're inspiring, but a little bit, for me, unattainable. And so sometimes discouraging at the same time. This morning I'm going to tell you the stories of two women who fall into that third category. The stories of two women who didn't seek greatness and probably never imagined it for themselves. Two women who were perhaps just born at the wrong time. Rosa Louise Macaulay was born in Tuskegee, Alabama on February 4th, 1913. Her mother was a teacher, and the family thus valued education. She attended high school, but left at 16 early into her 11th grade year to care for her dying grandmother, and shortly thereafter her chronically ill mother. In 1932, at the age of 19, she married her husband Raymond, a self-educated man, 10 years her senior, who worked as a barber. He supported his wife in her efforts to earn her high school diploma, which she ultimately did the following year. Rosa worked as a seamstress for the next 22 years. You might never have heard of her. The second woman lived long, long ago in the 6th century BC. The context for her story was the people of Israel in the time of the Babylonian captivity. As you heard last week when Pastor George taught us, earlier on in the timeline of the legacy of the nation of Israel, from where we're going to focus this morning, God had warned his people and warned them again. And even as the righteous King Josiah instituted reforms, it seemed in historical hindsight to be too little too late, because by the end of his life, his people were being taken into captivity, and there they were exiled for 70 years. Well, sometime during the 70 years of exile, the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Persian Empire. King Nebuchadnezzar displaced, and here 2 generations later, King Xerxes, Xerxes, a great word, by the way, to play if you want to baffle your kids in Hangman. No one ever guesses X. Was in charge. And so the people, forgotten by history, wondering if they had been forgotten by God, scattered across Mesopotamia and beyond, a shell of their former glory. It was into this dark time that this young woman was born. This is 2 stories of 2 women born at the wrong time. 2 women who could have been swept away in the tide of injustice. 2 women who chose to stand. And that's our title for this morning. Our series is Legacy. We're asking in 5 installments a simple question: how will you be remembered? What will it have meant to be you, and what does the Word of God have to say about that? Esther chapter 2 is where we'll begin. In verse 5, the Bible says, "At that time, there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa whose name was Mordecai." The fortress of Susa was the citadel where the Persian Empire had its capital. So he, like Daniel before him, as we heard about last week, is living in the shadow of the halls of power. His family had been among those who, with King Jehoiachin of Judah, had been exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. This man had a very beautiful and lovely young cousin named Hadassah. She was also called Esther. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter. And as a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many other young women, was brought to the king's harem. Well, what was the king's decree? For the sake of time, I'll summarize for you. Xerxes was a powerful and it would seem not unintelligent man, but a bit of a psychopath, it would seem as well from what we know of him. He became angry with his queen when she didn't come when called and appear to be displayed, and so he vanquished her. But no sooner had he done that than he missed her and her apparent beauty, and so he decided a good thing to do would be to pick a new queen contest. And so he instructed his officials to roust out from all of the lands in the Persian Empire, which was vast, the most beautiful women, and spend like a year getting them more beautiful, and then bring them to him, and he would have a sort of bachelor type contest and choose his new queen. Well, it was in the context of this search process and this competition of sorts that Esther comes to notoriety. She was an orphan and an exile, a child of slaves, and far, far from her family's home. Though the land in which she lived was the only home she had ever known, it was not the glorious home of her ancestors. And so she was without country or land and brought to the king's harem. And the king proceeded to have a selection process. In verse 16, the story continues. Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in early winter of the 17th year of his reign. And by taken to the palace, I'm euphemizing for the sake of keeping this thing PG-13, but suffice to say that the competition was not based on like Scrabble. So Esther won this dark competition, and the king loved her more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen. And you can say, well, good for Esther. Look at her. We think about it when we ever look at this backwater book of the Bible and we think, well, she had it good. Not so fast. Esther's ascension, as it were, was the result of exploitation and degradation of the very worst kind. She was objectified to the greatest extent. And then to be queen meant that she lived out her life in that harem, but more of the holding tank, rather more of the has-beens harem, not the holding tank harem. So there was the harem for those that were going to get exploited, and then there was the other for those that had been. And she only got to see the king if she was summoned. And so it wasn't as though she was living the life of royalty as we know it. Sure, she probably was the beneficiary of some opulent lifestyle, but she was a sex slave. That's what she was. And so, in this inauspicious way, Esther's story began. In chapter 3, it continues that sometime later, King Xerxes promoted a man named Haman to the position of the most powerful official in his empire. Well, all the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But listen, Mordecai, the man we met earlier, he refused to bow down or to show Haman respect. And this kind of reminds you of Daniel and his three friends whom Pastor George taught about last week. A few generations later, we see that this ember of a legacy, all but stamped out, continues to burn. And now Mordecai is carrying the torch. So Mordecai refused to bow down, and the palace officials asked, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, but still he refused to comply with the order. So of course, they went and told Haman to see how he was going to respond. And when Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage, like many an insecure man before him. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, that he was a Jew, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. So we see that, again, the people of Israel in a dark time come to the brink of annihilation and genocide, where Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, there's no way we're bowing down to you or a statue or anything else. It's just not going to happen. Haman, recipient, it would seem, of that legacy, makes a similar stand, but this time the stakes are higher. It's not just you who's going to be done away with, but all your people. What you see here, if you look closely, is a fascinating insight where a pole once stood as a legacy, an Asherah pole that was passed down like a generational iniquity that was allowed to stand even in the lives of the good kings. Where a pole once stood, a heritage of righteousness has emerged. Do you see it? Started back with Solomon, who wasn't a worshiper of foreign gods himself. No, he worshiped and honored God, and God blessed him. He worshiped God like no one else. But he had an issue of indiscipline with his sexuality. And so he kept on loving more and more women. And then to keep them all appeased, he made provision for their gods to be worshiped. And one generation's concession was the next generation's delight. Before long, his people were worshiping at the Asherah poles. And even when a good king would stand up like Asa and say, no, this isn't good, he didn't want to risk the unrest, the turmoil that would ensue. And so he let sleeping dogs lie. Well, so it passed from one generation to the next and to the next until Hezekiah watched his older brother getting burned in a fire as an offering of sacrifice to a false god named Molech, looking up perhaps before he went into the flames and asking his dad, how could you let it come to this? Well, Hezekiah obviously took the lesson to heart because he said, with me, this generational legacy stops and we're starting a new one. And so you see where there once was a pole, now there is a heritage of righteousness. And the way Daniel stood up, the way Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood up and said, we're not going to worship your pole. You can throw us in a furnace, you can feed us to lions, you can do whatever you want. It's simply not going to happen. Well, this thing got passed down, and you see the early effects of a legacy which, as Pastor George rightly pointed out, Josiah might have gone to his grave thinking was extinct. But God's way, do you know, is not like our way. In verse 8, Haman approached King Xerxes and said, there's a certain race of people scattered throughout the provinces of your empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it's not in the king's interest to let them live. If it please the king, issue a decree that they be destroyed. Oh, and I'll give 10,000 sacks of silver to the royal treasury if you do it. And so, Xerxes, ever the eccentric, and it would seem the opportunist, he agrees, and the decree was written in his name, sealed with his ring, dispatches sent by messengers into all the provinces of the land, giving order, listen, that the Jews, young and old, women and children alike, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. He ordered genocide, and he ordered all the subjects of his realm to take up arms against their Jewish neighbors and friends. And so, in their darkest hour, the people of Israel come to the brink of extinction. This was the age in which Esther was born. Meanwhile, back in early 20th century America, life was hard for people of African descent. Wrote one historian, coexisting with white people in a city governed by Jim Crow or segregation laws was fraught with daily frustrations. Blacks could attend only certain and inferior schools, could drink only from specified water fountains, could borrow books only from the black library, among many other distinctions. Black residents of Montgomery often avoided municipal buses if possible because they found the Negroes in back policy so demeaning and the setting so incendiary. Nonetheless, 70% or more riders on a typical day were black. They had to get to work, and most had no other way. So it was for Raymond and Rosa. They weren't looking to make waves, perhaps just keeping their head down. They were trying to make their way through life and get home from work. So it was with Esther back in 542 BC. She didn't like it, without a doubt. Being subjugated, being exploited, being objectified in such an atrocious way. Being a foreigner, being a stranger and an outcast. In Esther chapter 2, the Bible tells us she hadn't even told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai, her adopted dad, had told her not to. So she just left it with exotic beauty. Well, the time of disclosure had come. Mordecai sent word to Esther and asked her to intervene from her position of influence with the king. Esther's response, in effect, hey, I'm no hero, I'm nobody. And do you even understand the risks involved? This is a capital offense to go to the king without being sent. And in verse 13, the story continues. Mordecai sent this reply. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. Make no mistake about it, God will defend. But you and your relatives will die. But who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. And if I must die, I must die. And so the story went. At peril of death, Esther appeared before the king, shrewdly intervening on behalf of her people, saving God's chosen nation. And Haman got what was coming to him. I'll leave you to read the second half of the story for yourself. But what we see in Esther, the legacy contribution that she made, said, look up and look around. Recognize the darkness of our own day. The great injustices of our time are your injustices. The great conflicts of our day are your conflicts. What a tragedy it would be to sit quietly in the face of injustice and hope it will pass. The legacy of Esther, it's simple. When the time comes to take a stand, stand. with courage and grace. Live a life in which you stand for something. That's how a legacy is forged. Who knows whether you were put here for such a time as this? Centuries later, the ember of legacy continued to burn in the hearts of God's people. And in first century Palestine, you see a small rabble of Jews still refusing to be forced into subjugation and idolatry. The leaders of that day didn't like it any more than the leaders 6 centuries before, and so they arrested the apostles and put them in the public jail. But an angel of the Lord came at night, opening the gates of the jail, and brought them out. Then he told them, "Go to the temple and give the people this message of life." So at daybreak, the apostles entered the temple as they were told and immediately began teaching. They had been standing up and saying, "Jesus is the one you crucified. He is the Son of God, and he is the only hope for the world." Well, the religious leaders didn't like it. They didn't like having egg on their faces. They didn't like the people questioning their way of religion, and they didn't like the attention that this man continued to garner after they had put him to death. And so they told the apostles, "You can't be here. You can't preach this." And they said, "Don't you tell me what I can't do." And so they threw him in jail. But Jesus broke them out of jail because he's good like that. And instead of running for their lives and hiding across the border, I think probably the religious leadership would have been happy with that. They would have considered that mission accomplished because it silenced them. They got out of jail and they went right back to the temple. And they went right back to standing up and preaching what they had seen and heard. So this time in verse 40, they called in the apostles and had them flogged, figuring jail obviously didn't work. And then they ordered them never to speak again in the name of Jesus and let him go. And the apostles left the high council rejoicing that God had counted them worthy to suffer disgrace for Jesus. And every day they went back in the temple and they went from house to house and they continued to teach and preach this message: Jesus is the Messiah. And what you see as this legacy lives from generation to generation, and God's people build and add to it, we will not be told whom to worship, and we will not be made to be silent. What you see in their example is that when we stand against injustice, we stand with Jesus, and Jesus will make it right. This is why Jesus went to the cross. Jesus died, yes, to forgive us of our sins, to make a way for us to be renewed. But it wasn't just for the sin of last week. It was, as we looked at previously, for the iniquity of our family line, to give you the power to break the hold of that generational pattern that says, great-granddad was like it, granddad was like it, dad was like it. How different am I going to be? Jesus went to the cross so you and I can stand up and say, no longer, you shall not pass. But that's not all. He went to the cross to break the power of injustice, to make right what is wrong. Not to scuttle God's good creation and say, well, they made a mess of that, so we'll start over again in heaven, but to bring heaven to earth. Jesus, when he began his ministry, said, here's the good news, not that you get to die and fly away to heaven someday. Heaven is coming to you. And so Jesus in Revelation is recorded as saying, behold, I am making all things new. That's the gospel. Jesus is righting what is wrong, solving societal ills, bringing restitution to injustice. He's making all things new and setting the world to rights. And when we stand in our day and in our time, not looking to be heroes, merely standing up in the face of what is wrong, as representatives of Jesus, we stand in the power of the gospel. And it does not rely on us. It is not we in our voice or in our strength or in our sacrifice which will make the wrongs right. It is Jesus. But Jesus said, you are the light of the world, illuminating the darkness and pointing people to the one who redeems all things. This is the heart of the gospel. Ephesians 6 says our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It's not against the haters. It's not against the abusers. It's not against the subjugators. They're serving another, though they know it not. But it's against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God. Stand at the cross with Jesus, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you've done everything, to stand. Well, as it was in the beginning, from the first sin and the fall of humankind to the time of Esther and that dark day for the people of God, so it is now. The day of evil has arrived. Will you stand? On Thursday, December 1st, 1955, then 42-year-old Rosa Parks was commuting home from a long day of work at the Montgomery Fair department store. She was riding the bus. Segregation was written into law. The front of a Montgomery bus was reserved for white citizens, and the back seats, the seats behind them, for black citizens. Nonetheless, at one point on the route, a white man had no seat because all the seats in the designated white section were taken. So the driver told the riders in the 4 seats of the first row of the colored section to stand, in effect, adding another row to the white section. The 3 others obeyed. Rosa Parks did not. Eventually, 2 police officers approached the stopped bus, assessed the situation, and placed Parks in custody. The mugshot of that mom and seamstress went around the world, and the American Civil Rights Movement began. In her biography, Rosa Parks is quoted as having said, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired. But that isn't true. I was not tired, not physically. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in." She would have said, "I'm no hero." We would otherwise never have known her name. We don't know that perhaps she might not have been a good cook. Maybe Raymond was a snappy dresser. Their lives would have been lost to history were it not that in her day, against the odds of her generation, she stood. Or, ironically, she remained seated. Perhaps some of us would say, that's noble, but that's in the past. Or, I didn't know. Or, there are fights raging around me. There's darkness to be sure, but you know what? It's not my fight. To you, I would say what Proverbs says. If you say we didn't know anything about this, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who guards your life know? Dr. King said the ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over it by the good people. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. See, we've talked about breaking agreement, remember, with iniquity in our family line, looking to the sins of our fathers that have been passed down, tacitly agreed to generation after generation, and given free pass to our kids. We looked at the power in forging a legacy that the cross of Jesus affords us to say no more. If all my life means is to stop that thing, so be it. What we're talking about today is standing up to a generational or societal iniquity. The idea here is breaking societal agreement with the injustice all around us. As the people of God, looking up and looking out and seeing the darkness that pervades and saying, it's not okay with me. It may not perpetuate to the next generation. It may not feel like my problem, but I am alive today. I am a citizen of Denver in the 21st century, and that makes it my problem. I wonder how things could be different. Yesterday I was painting the kitchen with my wife, and she asked me what I was preaching on today. And sometimes you ask a preacher that and you get a paragraph, but normally what you get is a sermon. And I had a captive audience because she had the roller or the paintbrush. And so at the end of my discourse, Mari asked me an interesting question that I've pondered for the last day. She said, if you could be a voice in one way, in one expression of darkness, what would it have been? And I thought about it, and here's what I think it would be. I wish I could have been a founding father. I think I would have been dwarfed in that room. These guys were intellectual giants, and they had so much courage. And I have tons of respect for them. But I think it would have been good if one person had this particular bit of courage to say this. Okay, I like the draft. I mean, really, it's well worded. I think this thing's gonna live. There's just this one thing that maybe you just need to help me understand because it feels a little incongruous. This thing about how we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. But most of us own men. How does that work? Now, maybe I would have got lynched. But the thing is, we just finished fighting a war because we didn't want to be oppressed. I think that probably would have helped my argument. So is anybody else not okay with that? Is that curious to anyone else here? Right, so, no, I mean, I appreciate that you are not okay with that. I'm thinking if I were a founding father, I'd like to ask the other founding fathers, do any of you guys see that? Because there may be a day a couple centuries from now where there's a huge political row that we never could have anticipated, where some people are saying, you should just move to Canada if you don't want to sing our song. And listen, I like this song. It still gives me the goosebumps. I'm a third-generation military officer. So before you start throwing the shade my way, my family, we're always going to stand and put the hand on the heart at the national anthem. I'm just saying maybe it makes sense why some other people don't like our song. Because if I'm a founding father, I would have been like, they're going to write a song. And they're going to take this song that we wrote during our war, and they're going to sing it before every football game. And some guys are going to chafe at the land of the free and the home of the brave line because it maybe be misunderstood by some as the land of the enslaved and the home of the hypocritical and cowardly. I'm just saying it might look like that because nobody had the courage to ask the obvious question about this document. I would have liked to have been that guy. I might not have lived long. And so here we are. I'm not saying this has to be your issue. The world is rife with injustice. I'm just telling you it's mine. This is what God, I believe, asked me to do. I was a part of a really wonderful community in a fantastic church where we had like 10,000 friends that not only liked us, but were a lot like us, helping us raise our little kids. But I just couldn't get over an idea of a church that didn't look like one neighborhood in heaven, but looked like heaven. A church that didn't look like one segment of our city, but looked like our city. Because if Jesus meant what he said and people are going to come from the north and the south and the east and the west and take their places in the kingdom, we're going to have to figure each other out. And there is injustice in the way those dividing lines have been established. And I want to lean into that. I want to figure out what that is. And I don't claim to be any sort of hero. I simply want to build a church that looks like the city, that's intellectually honest, and that looks like heaven. That doesn't just continue tacitly to acknowledge unspoken agreements about division. When Jesus prayed one prayer for us, the future of his church, it wasn't that we would be holy, loving, or doctrinally correct. It was that we would be one and in our unity. The city would see the gospel on display. And so here's what I've learned in early returns, 10 years into this thing. When you try to do a church that's united across the spectrum, it's not as good of a black church as the black churches, and it's not as good of a white church as the white churches. It kind of suffers from Bo Jackson cross trainers fate. Remember those, any kids of the 80s? Like, we still sell basketball shoes for $130. We still sell running shoes for about $115. No one sells cross trainers anymore. You know why? Because they were not very good basketball shoes and they were not very good running shoes. Maybe that's the plight of a church that tries to be Jesus' heart for the city. But I say, let's go down trying. What's your cause? What will you stand up for? What matters? Because this is at the heart of what it means to leave a legacy. We wouldn't know Rosa Parks were it not for that decision that day. And being that person on that day when that day comes goes a long way to establishing what it will have meant to be us. I'm so proud of Grandma because she stood up and said, this is not okay. What will you stand up for? People are being exploited and subjugated right now in greater numbers than ever before in the history of the human race. Did you know there are more slaves on planet Earth right now than ever before at any single time? Is that okay? Here in America, in many ways, and around the world in numerous ways, women are subjugated, objectified, exploited, and it's met with a wink. Is that okay? I mean, this gets awfully political, and I'm not trying to press your buttons here. We are Democrat and Republican. I'm simply saying we are not head in the sand, not as Jesus people, not as people of the gospel. More than 50 million Americans have been killed before they had the opportunity to live. That's a greater genocide than any but perhaps Stalin's. We don't really know for sure. Right here in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Is that okay? Children die by the hundreds of thousands every week because they cannot drink clean water. Is that okay? Indonesia was turned upside down in the last week and a half, and it barely makes our news cycle because we have to listen to one more pair of acrimonious talking heads argue about the Supreme Court. Is that okay? Esther took the heritage that she received of no compromise and built on it a generational character that was woven into the fabric of the Jewish people that said, we will not be dominated by evil. We will not back down. We will never back down. And you see that character in that people to this day. What will you stand for? So let me just leave you with this. In preparing to take a stand, may I humbly ask, because this is what I think it means to be a follower of Jesus. Find the thing you can't stay seated about. I found mine. I care about a lot of things. I'm giving my life for one. I'm not looking to tell every other church how to do it, but I'm looking for a better version of Jesus' way. A church where we don't dwell in, but we live cognizant of the fact that in many of our parents and probably all of our grandparents' lifetime, there was a row on a bus for white people and another row for black people. That 200 years almost after these truths were documented as being self-evident. What will you stand for? What can't you stay seated about? And then secondly, the only other thing I want to ask of you, when you stand, will you stand for Jesus? Stand in truth and love. It's not our fight that's going to win the victory. It's Jesus who's making all things new. Now, there is a time to fight. When that time comes, fight. The Word of God says, be angry. And there's a time to be angry. And if you don't, you may not be alive. But it says, in your anger, do not sin. Will you stand in truth and love? Stand with Jesus and say, of the injustice that dominates our day, this is not okay. Amen. Would you stand with me? Why don't we just take a moment and respond in worship? Let's just close out our time as we began in God's presence, and then we'll get you on your way.